Hello and welcome to this podcast, The Open Word. And in this podcast, we are going to be dealing with issues that affect Guyana, the rest of the Caribbean, and the world. And of course, the issue of oil as it relates to Guyana is very important. And as you can see on the screen, we will be starting a series with Professor Clive Thomas on the issue of oil and gas. Professor Thomas, of course, has been writing on this issue for a very long time, and his weekly column in the Stabrook News, is reflective of his thoughts on this evolution as far as Guyana is concerned.
One race from the same place that make the same trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region for we woman and we children. That must be the ambition of the Caribbean and the Caribbean and the Caribbean.
Yes, and the theme there of the Open Word. Professor Thomas, welcome to the Open Word podcast.
Thank you for inviting me, David.
And as I said in the introduction, that you have been writing and thinking about oil and gas in general, and in particular, as far as Guyana is concerned, going way back. And often we hear the conversations about oil and gas in Guyana, and there have been lots of voices weighing in from the environmental standpoint, from the political standpoint. But I think that we wanted you on this podcast so that you can put it in its larger economic perspective and to situate Guyana within the context of our region, the hemisphere, and the world. You've used the term petrostate, and I don't usually hear that terminology used to describe Guyana, but I think it's apt that you use the term petrostate. What does it mean for Guyana to become a petrostate in the 21st century?
Well, to begin with, I have not invented the word or the phrase. Sometimes it's written separately, sometimes it's written together jointly as one word, petrostate. I have not invented the term or the word. It has been used a lot in Latin America, particularly emanating from Brazil, where there was an effort to develop a school of thought linked to our dependency schools of thought within the West Indian region, where they see the production of oil and its export overseas as an extractivist regime, where it's concerned with extracting from the earth products that are going to be sold to the metropolitan center and generate income and benefits for the countries concerned. After it reaches a certain level, and it has to be defined in terms of weight of the oil exports in terms of your own exports. It has to be defined in terms of the oil production and oil exports in terms of your GDP. It has to be weighed in terms of the classes that control this production, the government classes. It has to be weighed in terms of the external environment in which it takes place. That gives it the nature of a petrostate. The term has been first applied to Guyana in 2021, 2020, which was a remarkably short time after we started production because our first oil produced was in December 2019. And it was used in Latin America and it was termed the petrostate as the fastest rising phenomenon in the whole of the Western Hemisphere. So it was called America's newest and fastest emerging petrol state. That has continued to be the situation up to now. Because, as you know, Guyana is the fastest growing economy in the world, the fastest growth rate in terms of oil production from any country and exports. And therefore, that label has been stuck. But what I've tried to argue in the presentations that you have been reading or alluding to earlier is that this phenomenon is not only being recognized as a petrol state by Latin American scholars, but it's also being recognized by Western scholars in the neoliberal school. And they too have termed the phenomenon as an exceptional oil opportunity. And the proof of that is two studies that have been completed, one by the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank.
And the World Bank. And we're going to come to those studies, Professor Thomas, but you raised at the beginning the question of the dependency school, and you are very much part of that dependency school.
Well, I'm considered a founder member because my thesis, PhD thesis, was a dependency theory in relation to Ghana.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. So what I want you to do, and of course we didn't plan this very well, is to situate this extractive oil industry within the context of the dependency theory. Is it a plus? Is it a minus? How does the dependency theorists deal with this phenomenon of extracting oil from the region as a form of accumulation of wealth for the countries from which the oil is being extracted?
Well, it's not only the accumulation of wealth, but the distribution of the wealth. Mm-hmm. Because the extractivist school, like the dependency school, believes that there's an unequal distribution. It goes largely to the overseas contractors who are involved in producing the oil, and not to the government, as in the case of Ghana, who owns the oil. Because we are owner of the oil, we contract with Exxon and its partners to produce the oil under production sharing agreement. So that is the difference between the two. The extractivist school, I would consider an extension of the dependency school. It allows for the bringing into play not only industries that could be considered important, like oil and gas and bauxite and alumina and super production and so forth, but it brings into play the modern industries like finance, communication, things like that, which also get extracted from our region and exported abroad. And then the profits and benefits are unequally distributed within the region.
So, Professor Thomas, I've put on the screen there one of your columns about 6 weeks ago in the Stabrook News, looking backwards and going forward, retrospect and prospect. And I thought we would start there because prior to doing this column, you had been exploring and analyzing the various companies that are extracting oil in Guyana. So looking backwards and going forward, retrospect and prospect. Let's start with looking backwards.
Looking backwards, I focused, first of all, let me start where I began. Oil was discovered in Guyana in May 2015. And I started to write a Sunday column in 2016 for the Stabrook News. I was in fact writing that column prior to my moving into the oil and gas sector. I was doing a general economics analysis, political economy analysis of Guyana and the world in that column. But I became concerned that we had little experience in the oil and gas sector, and that I would like to apply the experience that I have been able to accumulate over the years towards making sure that we had at least one local scholar that might develop some level of expertise in the area and could write with some authority on what was happening within the Guyana economy. So that's where the article started. In the first phase of the development of the article, before that one was written, I focused largely on the use of neoliberal economics to analyze what is happening. But increasingly, I came to realize that the development of the extractivist school could put a perspective on what was happening that was somewhat different from the neoliberal school. Even though it turned out, as you will notice when you come to read the more recent articles, that the neoliberal school had equally early identified that we were becoming one of the fastest, and if not the fastest rising petroleum state in the world, producing state. And they too began to share the view of our exceptional production, our exceptional status on the global stage. So I've now been trying to analyze this phenomenon in that context and to share the insights that I can be developed from this perspective with the Guyanese public. And that's on the column that I've been writing every week. So right now, what has happened is that the production sharing agreement that the Guyana government has had from the beginning, the inception, although it has been amended slightly over the 2 years, is going to be changed substantively, I think, or substantially, because the government intends to move towards public auctions. So what I'm trying to do currently is to take stock of where Guyana is in terms of the shape and form of the industry, to see if after public auctions, which I expect would change the price, the resource price at which the oil is offered to the investor, will have any effect on the fortunes of the oil industry as an oil industry in Guyana. Whether that price will trigger more development because more prospects are there than negative, or whether it might hinder. I'm not certain what will happen in the outcome. But the government is definitely committed towards moving from a production sharing agreement that they have negotiated bilaterally to a public auction, which they've announced. They've postponed it somewhat, but I hope will be held sometime this year. So right now, and currently I'm writing on this, taking stock of where the price of that resource is, and the PSA as an offer by the government to investors to invest in Guyana. That is the average effective tax rate. That's what we call it in economics, or the government take, and then see what happens if that goes up with the forthcoming events post the public auction. So that's where I was at this point in time.
Yeah. Professor Thomas, I want you to spend some time on where we are now. Oil was found in 2015. We started to pump, 2019?
December 26, 2019.
2019. Great.
Effectively,
But in making an analysis of where, or an assessment of where we are now, I want you to start at the point of predictions, because as I remember it, you predicted a certain volume of production, and there were others who disagreed with you. So I want you to start there and to come to where we are now in Guyana as far as the industry.
In 2016, I made what many call a ridiculous prediction. I predicted that Guyana had 11 to 12 billion barrels of oil within this offshore area, and that would be part of the reserves and resources that investors could exploit. The response by excellent yard investors was to say they only discovered 600 million, not even a billion, 0.6 of a billion. And of course, local writers jumped in and shared that view too. And there are even people on writing that might be embarrassed at what they wrote 4 years ago with tremendous shit. That no matter what we ever do, we never reach 1 billion barrels of oil. So my forecast stood out in strong contrast to what was the case. The question which you should probably be asking me after is why did I arrive at such a bullish forecast on oil? And there are two reasons for that. First, I tried to do some desk research on oil potential and discovered that for many years going back, a couple of decades or more, there was a theory called the Atlantic mirror image, which was held by some geologists, that the formations on the eastern coast of South America mirrored that on the western coast of Africa because it was one continuous continent, Pangaea, which drifted apart over geological time, that's over millions and millions of years. So the configurations that are found off the coast of Guyana and Brazil and Suriname are similar to those to be found off the western end of Africa. And at that point in time, Africa had already begun to find significant deposits of oil, the Jubilee mines and so on, Jubilee wells in Western Africa. So I became intrigued by that. And purely on intuition, I developed a gut feeling, because I'm not a geologist, that there's more to this thesis conceptually than people give credit to. And because of that, I started to explore the literature to see if anybody has developed any concrete assessments and around that thesis. And lo and behold, I discovered that in 2000, United States of all places Geological Services, USGS, had initiated a world study of undiscovered gas and oil. And had found that in the Noah Basin, the offshore basin, were deposits of oil which, based on their probability models, let's say at 95% probability would have 5 billion barrels. At around 50%, would have 10 to 13 barrels. And around 5% probability of it being there would have over 30 billion barrels. And I opted for the mean of that, the 50% thing, and I began to become convinced that the events will unfold to let that mean represent what we could do. And lo and behold, right now, the oil companies are predicting that we have 10 plus or 11 billion at least barrels of oil within the areas that we're exploring. Now, I feel that is an understatement, and it's a deliberate not a deliberate understatement, a cautious understatement, because they don't want to trade motives. Because the more you declare that you have found or you think you potentially found, the weaker become in the bargaining over their oil contract.
Yes.
So they have no incentive to say what I'm saying. And I have therefore worked out very recently. The article, in fact, has not yet been published, but I think I hinted at it in one that was written a week ago because I have to write these articles weeks ahead, because so many interruptions, I have to make sure that I don't miss any week. I have to write them at least 5-6 weeks ahead. I've been able to establish that based on these same probabilistic models, because they are frank when they say that the models are probabilistic models based on their assessments and contingencies of what might happen. I've upped my prediction to 28 to 30 billion barrels. Now, the government is advertising the public auction states out of the blue, even though their own producers are saying this is the right amount, that we have 24 billion barrels. So you could see that there is obviously unclarity on which end of the spectrum the values actually fall. And my estimate is not only one that I explain how I arrived at it, and do say that is the probabilistic estimate, but intended to nudge awareness and prevent the people from adopting what they call a stingy stratagem against us by holding on to resources, because the more we cannot demonstrate that we have all resources we think we have, the weaker we are in terms of bargaining. But you know, the foolish people around us don't recognize that.
Right. And that's the takeaway that has
Completely
jumped out.
ignore it. Yeah.
Yes, that's the takeaway that has jumped out at me. And that is the relationship between your bargaining strength and your ability to prove, if you will, or to make an argument about the volume of oil that is there. And I think that's a big revelation. As the government, this government, the previous government, have they contacted you to talk
They have
about
never
your findings?
neither them nor even you ever contacted me. One iota to discuss or understand anything about the soil industry.
Yeah.
I don't mind because it gives me an independence that I treasure, that I don't have to be following any particular line. It allows, I think, for independent critical thought. I think that I'm disappointed, though, that most middle class people like us are vain and ego driven, and most of them seem to enjoy, quote unquote, putting down Guyana. And I find that very, very disheartening. Even though I have a principal difference with the authorities and the way in which they're handling the matter, I would never reduce it to want to stand in the way of the poor people of Guyana getting the benefits that they deserve from this fortuitous find these fortuitous discoveries. Remember, what we are aiming to do with it is, I believe, we should try and target it to get rid of poverty as the first concrete step coming out of the finds. And if we set about to do that resolutely, everything else is secondary. For the time being, there'll be a point when we don't have poverty and where we have to begin to operate with plenty. And I believe to manage plenty is far easier than to manage scarcity and poverty. It's easier to deal with overabundance than to deal with too little. So my task is to try and encourage people to focus on the essential task of getting rid of poverty, and then let's begin to deal with the other challenges. What's the best way to use our resources? Because the best way to use it immediately is to remove the single biggest obstacle to the development of Canada. And that is foretold by both the dependency school and the extractive school. They both concede that the single biggest impediment for the future development of countries in this state is the use of the oil money to transform livelihoods, to make sure that at the end of the period that the oil money has generated the eradication of substantial poverty within the community. And this is doubly compounded by the fact that the oil industry is on the threat of a transition away from carbon fuels, carbon emitting fuels. So the window of opportunity we have for producing oil is small. So I get very upset with our middle class people like myself who consume more carbon emitting goods to feed themselves, to clothe themselves, to house themselves, to transport themselves, to entertain themselves than any people that ever lived in Guyana before, and will not recognize that they have poor people among them, and therefore you have to give that priority. And going after ideal sort of environmental goods cannot be the first priority. Poverty causes most of the degradation of the economy, degradation of society, and that's the way most people die. Life itself depends on being able to be less than poor. The average extension of life grows with time, grows with development. And you can't come to me, own a computer, own a smartphone, driving a fancy car and tell me that you would prefer to be able to maintain that status by halting production for environmental reasons and not benefiting and make sure that people in Guyana at least move themselves out of poverty as the first priority. I will never accept that. I will accept the right to sustain sustainable development over time.
Yeah.
But we can't solve the world's problems. No one country can. We have to do other things in concert with other peoples, but we can't deny our people. So the mentality that's why I'm sorry I'm not teaching still. Because I get the feeling from the students that they have fallen into this perpetual abuse of Guyana that is really degrading. And when we first started to struggle to improve the livelihood of the people, we were struggling for something that I thought was recognized widely as the first condition. It's not the end and be all of everything, but we must, as a minimum, ensure we don't have the poor among us. Maybe because I grew up poor, but I'm middle class now. And I also get use up all the same technology that they use. All the same rare metals that are in my smartphone, my computer now that I'm speaking on. So I can't, I think that's a pumpy set over the rest of the economy and talk about how I'm going to deprive the people of this and that. I've heard people actually I've seen them like in private social media that they prefer the oil industry to shut down and continue like this. They consider crass in humanity.
See
but
why?
anyhow,
Yeah, no. I think the direction in which you've gone is very important in framing the series that we have set out to do. Are you in effect saying that we should not pose the question of environment versus the alleviation of poverty? That we should pose...
I'm saying that we should pose it.
Yeah.
But we should give precedence to poverty.
Okay.
I'm not against trying to get a better environment for everybody to live in. I'm not against that, but we have to put it in perspective. We can't place the burden of doing that on the poor people because that's what we're doing. when we don't recognize that the poor must be the first priority. I can't, from the comfort of my house, have somebody living on the streets pay for the environmental sustainability of Ghana, and I don't want to pay for it because I have a smartphone, I have a computer. And I feed, clothe, and house myself, transport myself, entertain myself. Even the lipstick and things I put on my face or whatever it is, or hair grease or whatever it is. All these things are environmentally degradation, degrading environment. And we do it without a flinch. Yet we find it hard to recognize that poor people should be given priority over that.
Professor
And that's when we don't cut back that.
Professor Clive Thomas posing what I think is a fundamental question, and it's a question that has confronted all petrostates, especially those in the so-called underdeveloped or developing countries. And it is that as we engage issues of the environment and so forth, we also must put into the mix the question of poverty and the alleviation of poverty. On that note, Professor Thomas, we are going to leave it there for now. And when we come back next week, we are going to start at this point and then do an assessment of where the industry is at the moment, where Guyana is in terms of how it's handling the industry, the fallouts, what are we doing correctly, what are we not doing correctly. I want to thank you for coming on today and for raising a couple of fundamental issues. Any last thoughts before we go?
I'd like to thank you for inviting me. I thought it was a useful discussion. I got a little heated towards the end. I hope
but that's all right.
But tell us I've been off the circuit for a long time.
Right.
Anyhow, thanks very much. I think there are a lot of important issues to come.
Wonderful. And of course, I've introduced this series because I wanted another angle to the conversation. Understandably, there is a lot of conversation about oil and gas, conversations around the contract, conversations around the environment, conversations around the behavior of the companies in the industry, conversations about local content. But there has not been any conversation about poverty in all of this. And given Professor Thomas's ideological tradition, the tradition from which he comes, I thought that he would be able to put poverty in the mix. Of course, his party, the WPA, has already introduced the whole question of a universal basic income and the question of caste transforms as a democratic way of dealing with the distribution of the resources. So I thought that this would be a good addition to the conversation. And I'm extremely glad that Professor Thomas has agreed to have this conversation. So until next week, I want to thank you all for tuning in to this edition of the Open Word, Politics 101 podcast.
One race from the same place that make the same trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region. For we woman,